Hi, I'm Jenny Ray, the Managing Director of Management Consulted, and I'm back today to continue our series on case interviews. In particular today, we're talking about problem solving. Problem solving is one of the most critical things that you need to demonstrate as an interviewee sitting in the hot seat in a consulting interview. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to break down problem solving into 4 key areas and how it's demonstrated with success in the interviews, as well as key mistakes that we often see when we're working with case interview candidates. So without further ado, let's get started. The first thing that is incredibly important to demonstrate when you're thinking about problem solving in case interviews is that you are excellent at math. Now, there's a lot of confusion that has come about around the math issue. First of all, the idea of mental math is a common hang-up. Consulting firms are not looking for you to do math without writing anything down. When they say mental math, what they mean is that they want you to simplify a lot of the key assumptions and take shortcuts. But they're not saying that you have to compute everything in your mind without writing anything down. What they are saying, however, is that you will not be able to use a calculator. So you need to make sure that your process and your flow is at a high enough level that you're able to demonstrate your facility, your ease with math and numbers. So let me break this down into a couple of different areas. To be excellent at math, you will break down each math section into 3 different parts. The first one is the algebra that you use. We talked in the structure section about how you actually break down each one of the math parts, and the algebra is the structure that you use. The assumptions are the data pieces that you use. In some cases, like market sizing cases, you will come up with the assumptions. In other cases, like standard cases where they'll give you a chart or a graph with information on it, the chart or the graph will serve as the data points that you'll fill in for those assumptions that were missing. And then finally, there are calculations, actually manipulating the numbers to come up with a new answer and come up with an additional insight. The second thing that's important to be excellent at math is that you can keep track of everything clearly on your paper. This is a common issue for many of you, especially those of you that have any history in science or the medical profession, because your handwriting is terrible. But here, what they're looking for is your ability to chronicle what you are doing in the math, essentially in spreadsheet format. What that looks like is very clearly demarcated math numbers, math calculations, and ultimate summaries of the math. The third thing that's important is that you can confidently double check your numbers. So at the end of the day, after you've walked through the math very clearly, the algebra, the assumptions, and the calculations, and you've gone through and kept track of everything by writing it down and keeping track of it clearly on your paper, at the end you can go back and you can say, great, let me just double check and make sure that my numbers are appropriate. This is going to become incredibly important when we talk about the next part of problem solving. Some key mistakes that we often see when people are trying to demonstrate that they're excellent at math but not able to do it clearly are the following. First, they don't include all the necessary data. So, for example, they may not clarify at the beginning of the math problem what the endpoint is supposed to be. Oftentimes, I give cases where the endpoint is profit, but I don't give the profit percentage. That's something that the interviewee is going to have to ask me. So they'll come up with this great calculation and get me all the way to revenue, but that wasn't what I was asking for. So make sure at the beginning of every math question that you're clarifying where you're headed. And in addition, that as you're walking through the process, you're not making assumptions or giant leaps when you need to just ask for one missing piece of data in the process. The second one is that they don't take clear notes of their calculations. I've already talked before about how important it is to take clear notes. If you're not able to take clear notes, when I tell you at the end that I want you to change a number, you're not going to be able to do it. When I tell you that you made a mistake, you're not going to be able to identify it. And you're just generally not going to build confidence in me as your boss and manager. If later, when you're actually on the job, you bring me numbers, you have to be able to defend every single one of them. And so here, clear note taking is the beginning of being able to do that. In addition, it's really important that you do simple calculations like division in the easy way, not the long way. If you do them in the long way, then you're making a mistake. So if you're writing out, for example, big number multiplication or big number division, and you're actually using the dividing sign or you're using columns of multiplication, that is doing something the long way. That's not demonstrating the kind of math that I'm looking for. I'm looking for you to be able to take shortcuts, to break down percentages into factors of 10%, to be able to identify quick ways to do each part of your math. So again, you don't have to do it without writing, but you also can't do it the most long, arduous, and impossible way either. So that's the beginning piece of being able to be a good problem solver, is just being excellent at math and clear with your notes as you're going through the process. The next part that's really important is that you're able to quickly realize and correct your mistakes. They happen to the best of us. Mistakes, in fact, happen to, I would imagine, almost every person who goes through the MBB process. At some point within your process, you're going to make a small mistake. And it is not by any means a deal breaker to make that mistake, but it is, like I've said before in our intro video to the series, it is a deal breaker to make the mistake and not catch it. So at the end of each part of the process, in order to quickly realize and correct your mistakes, you're going to be doing a few things. The first is that you'll check the answers at the end to see if they're reasonable. If you're not sure that they're reasonable, you need to think about a way to do that, which brings me to the second piece. If you're not sure whether they're reasonable, you need to triangulate your answers. What I mean by that is think of another way that you could measure whether or not it's reasonable. So if you come up with a number of X per household, then go back and just try to determine, is that a reasonable number? If you think about the actual usage in a household, if you use that number in the beginning, think about another way to come at it. You're trying to come up with a second way to corroborate your initial conclusion to make sure that you're not totally bonkers when you're proposing it to the client. The third thing is to make sure that if you messed up, you acknowledge clearly, oops, I made a mistake. Here is where the mistake was. Let me quickly go back and fix it. If you make the mistake, it's not an issue, but if you try to cover it up, or if you acknowledge that there was a mistake and don't show the initiative to go back and fix it, that is a really key problem, because it's likely that if you do that in a case interview, you're going to do that with me on the job, which is going to create big problems for me when I'm going to try to justify something to a client and the numbers are wrong, and then we work ourselves into a huge, nasty hole. Some key mistakes that we see in this area are the following. First of all, crappy notes make going back impossible. So you have to make sure you're taking clear notes in the process. The second thing is fighting for a wrong answer. If I question your answer at the end, you want to make sure that you also question your answer. I'm not asking for you to defend to the death what your answer is. I'm asking you probably to clarify why you think that answer is right. So I'm either looking for just some additional insight, but I'm probably telling you that you're wrong. And I'm giving you the opportunity to go back and find that error before I find it for you. The third thing that's important is making sure that you talk through your thoughts. By not talking through your thoughts, so by going silent when you're actually working through the math process, or by just telling me the numbers but not the additional calculation steps that you're taking behind each part, all that you're doing is give me the opportunity to identify errors that you're not identifying. So make sure that you're talking through step by step the entire process so that if you make a mistake, I see exactly where the mistake is and I can quickly help you go back and fix it. You also, if you get good at talking through the process, are going to find your mistakes more quickly. So that concludes the second part of problem solving, which is just making sure that when you do make a mistake, which often happens, just go back and fix it and make sure that you fix it in an appropriate way. The next thing that's critical to make sure that we understand is that you're adept at tying data to overall conclusions. Problem solving isn't just about math. It's not just about calculating numbers. It's also about using those numbers to tell the client what they should do. So if the client finds that there's a growth rate of 8% in a particular segment, what does it mean they should do? Should they focus on that segment? If so, what kinds of resources should they think about applying to that segment? What kind of implementation steps should they think about using? So making sure that you're identifying how to use the data to tie it to overall conclusions is really critical here. Let me break this down into a couple of pieces. There are two key ways that you can tie data to the overall solutions. The first one we call in consulting the so what. Why should we care about what that amazing number is that you just calculated? A lot of people come to the end of the process and say, ta-da, the number is 100 million, but they don't give me any sense of why that should matter to the client, right? So the so what is what the client would say right after that, right? 100 million, so what? Make sure that you are tying that to the bigger picture. The next thing that's critical in the second part of tying it to the overall conclusion is making sure that you're highlighting next steps. Next steps are after you've gone through the data and identified the number, after you've identified what the so what is, what this number means to the client, then the next thing that you talk about is what the client should do next. So those three pieces, identifying what the data answer is, identifying what it means, and then identifying what the client should do next, is a part of every quantitative question, which is really the key bulk of problem solving inside cases. There are some key mistakes, however, that you could make in these areas, so make sure that you don't fall into one of these traps. The first one I call relief coma. It's when you finish the math without driving to the next piece. You just get so excited that your calculation is finished that you don't tie it to these next two pieces. Don't fall into relief coma. Make sure that you're constantly pushing the case forward. This relief coma is a constant symptom of people who train for just McKinsey style cases, because the interviewer is the one who generally will ask the next question. This is one of the reasons why I really recommend that early on in your case training, you start out with interviewee-led training where you're actually driving forward in the process, because when you're doing math, you'll make sure that you tie these two pieces in. McKinsey's still looking for these pieces. They're still looking for you to still drive the case forward. They're just going to take the case wherever they want to go. The next thing that's critical is that if you don't tie the so what to the client's main issue, you're really missing out on an opportunity to drive forward toward the answer. You, at this point, could answer a math question that has no bearing on the client's ultimate issue, and therefore you demonstrate that you as a consultant are completely irrelevant to the client's issue. You don't want to be irrelevant as a consultant. You want to make sure that the answers that you're driving at are really critical to helping the client solve their problem. So make sure that you tie the so what back. And the final thing is just not including next steps. If you don't identify next steps, you're not thinking like a consultant. Consultants make money off of next steps. Every additional step that they take inside the scope of the case helps a client become more satisfied because they drive further toward implementation. Every next step at the end of the case helps a client identify what the key issue should be that they should focus on next, and often provides a role opportunity for a consulting firm, which is the ultimate awesomeness because it results in additional work for the consulting firm. So this is additionally the third piece that you have to focus on, making sure that you're tying everything in the problem solving back to the original issue. The final thing that's critical to make sure that you focus on is that you're maintaining a focus and awareness on the hypothesis, if there is one, and also driving to the solution. Now, let me just quickly address hypothesis-driven approaches. All consulting firms are interested in understanding what your priorities are, where you think the key issues are. Some cases, yes or no cases, like should we enter this market, or M&A cases, absolutely lend themselves to hypotheses. Other cases are two parts. There's a problem identification and a solution identification. In those cases, it's a lot harder to come up with a hypothesis because basically there are two pieces. First, what the problem is. Second, what the solution is. So make sure that no matter what, whether you're using a hypothesis or not, you do understand what the key issue is for a client. You cannot use problem solving effectively if you don't understand what the client's key issues are. If you don't understand in general, naturally, what the client's key issues are, make sure that you're working on articulating them in a case, and that you're prompting the partners that you're working with on case interviews to ask you so that you make sure that you understand it. The second thing that's critical to understand here is that every case has a core problem. So if it doesn't have a hypothesis, make sure that you focus on the core problem like I was talking about before. And then the final piece of this is making sure that you're managing the time allowance. Across the board, as you're working through the entire process of a case, tying everything back to the hypothesis means making sure that you are on time and delivering everything according to schedule, which in the case interview could be a very short period of time. So just make sure that you're managing the time allowance. The key mistake that we see in this area is when somebody is asking or answering a whole bunch of questions, but without a focus on really what the key issues are. If you're not able to do this, then you're not demonstrating structure, which we talked about in the last video, but you're also not demonstrating active problem solving, which is making sure that you're focused on the key problem, asking the direct questions and only the most efficient direct questions to get you to the answer, and then ultimately providing a recommendation for the client. So if you tie all of these areas together, you're going to have amazing problem solving when you're working through the cases. You're going to have great notes, clear process, an amazing way to identify when you do make mistakes, and finally the ability to tie everything back to the big picture and drive everything back toward the hypothesis. If you've got more questions about how to solve problems inside cases, make sure that you get a copy of our Consulting Interview Bible or work with us on a session so we can identify how you're doing. If you've got further questions in the meantime, feel free to visit us on the website at managementconsulted.com.